Imagine trying to run a national telecommunications network where, half of your physical cell towers are just completely cut off from the power grid.
Right, just totally dark.
Exactly. And missiles are actively flying over your data centers. And to top it all off, you've just been hit by a massive 36-hour cyber attack that basically knocks out all your core services.
I mean, it is the absolute definition of a total operational nightmare. It's a scenario where the only rational business objective is just, well, basic day-to-day survival.
Yeah, just keeping the lights on. But now imagine taking that exact same company, operating under those exact same brutal conditions, and successfully listing it on the American NASDAQ stock exchange.
It sounds entirely fictional. Like, it really sounds like a thought experiment from some crazy business school seminar.
Right. Well, welcome to today's deep dive. We are thrilled to have you with us because today's mission is to explore an astonishing corporate survival story that defies absolutely all conventional business logic.
Oh, completely defies it.
We are looking at Kyivstar, which is Ukraine's largest mobile operator, and the actual mechanics behind how they pulled off the first ever wartime IPO in world history.
And the sheer audacity of this, like both the financial and operational maneuvers, it just makes it an unprecedented case study in corporate resilience.
It really does. So to understand how they actually executed this, we've pulled together a really fascinating stack of materials for you.
Yeah, we've got a lot of good stuff today.
We do. We are pulling insights from transcripts from the 2026 Ukraine House Davos panel, a CNBC TV interview with their CEO, several really in-depth financial news articles on their recent acquisitions, and a highly detailed corporate presentation deck.
The deck is wild, by the way.
Oh, it's incredible. Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can even begin to understand how this company physically operates on the ground in an active war zone, we first need to look at the financial maneuver that caught Wall Street's attention.
Yeah, because the financial engineering here is just as staggering as the physical engineering.
For sure.
In that Davos transcript, Giovanni Salvetti, he's a partner at the financial advisory firm Rothschild, he shared this incredible anecdote about how this whole thing started.
The email, right.
Yes. He came up with the idea to take this Ukrainian company public during the war, and he literally placed the concept into what he called his Mission Impossible folder.
Wow.
Yeah. And then he sent the pitch over to his colleagues in New York.
And they printed the email out and literally left it on the floor of their office.
Just on the floor.
Yeah, they dubbed it the craziest email of the year.
I mean, you can see why. Conventional wisdom on Wall Street dictates that markets absolutely despise uncertainty.
Right. They hate it.
And there is nothing more fundamentally uncertain than a full-scale invasion. But the mechanics of how Kyivstar actually bypassed that skepticism are just brilliant. They avoided a traditional initial public offering entirely.
Okay, so what did they do instead?
Instead, they utilized a SPAC.
All right, a special purpose acquisition company. We've seen a massive wave of those over the last, 5 or so years. You essentially have a blank check shell company that is already publicly traded, and it merges with a private company to take it public. In this case, they merged to list under the ticker KYIV.
And that structure is key to understanding the sheer anomaly of what happened next. Historically, when a SPAC announces its merger target, the original investors in that blank check company, well, they tend to get skittish.
Yeah, they pull out.
Right. The standard market behavior is that about 90% of those SPAC shareholders just cash out their shares before the merger is even finalized.
Okay, wait, hold on. 75% of the shareholders actually stayed in for the Kyivstar merger.
Yep, 75%.
That means they kept their capital in a company actively navigating a war zone. I mean, I understand having sympathy for Ukraine, but Wall Street doesn't run on charity.
No, it definitely doesn't.
The math on that risk assessment makes absolutely no sense to me. Wait, how does an investor actually price the risk of a total country capitulation? It's like crash testing a car while you're actively driving it down the highway.
What's fascinating here is that Salvetti addressed that exact skepticism. Because you're right, capital isn't brave, capital isn't reckless, and it certainly isn't charitable.
Right.
Those investors looked at the underlying numbers and saw something highly unusual. They saw rational capital.
Meaning, they basically stripped away the geopolitical headlines and just looked at the raw financial performance.
Precisely. They saw a company maintaining a high-margin business, throwing off really strong cash flows, and generating over 20% year-over-year growth
20%.
during an active conflict.
Yes. Institutional investors modeled the risk and realized that telecommunications in a war zone ceases to be a mere service.
Oh, I see.
It transforms into critical life-saving infrastructure that grants the company incredibly inelastic demand. Like, people will stop buying almost anything else before they stop paying for the ability to call their families to see if they are safe.
Oh, wow. That drastically reframes the risk. So the base case for these investors wasn't some overly optimistic scenario where, a peace treaty gets signed tomorrow.
No, not at all. The base case was that the conflict continues indefinitely.
Yeah.
And yet, the company is already thriving under the absolute worst-case scenario stress test imaginable.
Exactly. And the CEO, Oleksandr Komarov, articulated this perfectly on CNBC. He explicitly refused to call this a liquidity event.
Because in the startup world, a liquidity event is usually founders cashing out their shares to buy yachts.
Right. But Komarov called this a credibility event. It was a clear signal to the global market that they possess absolute permanence.
And they back that credibility up with serious capital, too. I mean, their parent company, VEON, committed a massive $1 billion investment into Ukraine, stretching from 2023 to 2027.
Which is an aggressive statement of intent.
Yeah, it really is.
It is. But that 20% growth rate wasn't achieved just by keeping the basic phone lines running. To understand why those investors stay, you have to look at what Kyivstar was building behind the scenes.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because they didn't just rebuild cell towers. They fundamentally transformed themselves from a basic utility provider into this unavoidable digital ecosystem.
Unavoidable is the perfect word for it.
They currently hold a 47% market share in the country, which translates to 23.3 million subscribers. They essentially position themselves as the Apple of Ukrainian telecoms.
Right. They shifted their entire strategy away from a race-to-the-bottom price war with competitors like Vodafone or LifeCell.
Yeah.
Instead, they focused on building a premium, high-quality ecosystem that users simply cannot afford to leave.
And they built this ecosystem by going on an incredibly aggressive acquisition spree. Like, the sheer audacity of deploying capital to buy up tech startups during an invasion is mind-blowing. Let's break down the portfolio. First, they acquired Uklon for $155 million.
Right. And Uklon is essentially the Ukrainian Uber, and they completely dominate the local market.
With 3.8 million active users. But, user count doesn't tell the full story. The wild part is the underlying profitability. Uklon delivers a 28% EBITDA margin.
That is massive.
It is. For anyone listening who doesn't spend their day staring at balance sheets, EBITDA basically means your core operational profitability before the accountants get involved with taxes and depreciation.
Just the raw cash generation.
Well, exactly. And to put a 28% margin in perspective, Uber's margin generally hovers around 12%.
Wow.
Uklon is a cash-generating machine. And because traditional rail and air travel in Ukraine are completely disrupted by the war, Uklon seamlessly expanded its software to handle intercity bus tickets.
See, they leveraged their digital dominance to solve a sudden physical logistical crisis.
Right.
But they didn't limit their ambitions to transportation. They moved really aggressively into public health.
Yeah, they bought an app called Helsi for $26 million. Helsi is the de facto public health infrastructure for the entire country. We're talking about 28 million users.
It's huge.
Kyivstar acquired it and turned it into a highly profitable health super app. And then to complete the puzzle, they bought tabletki.ua for $160 million.
Right. And Tabletki is a massive pharmacy booking platform. If we look at the underlying logic here, it reveals a brilliant corporate strategy.
Oh, so.
By integrating Helsi and Tabletki, Kyivstar engineered a completely closed-loop healthcare journey.
Oh, I see.
Think about the user experience. You consult your doctor via video on the Helsi app. You receive your e-prescription digitally.
Right.
You immediately purchase the medication through the Tabletki integration. And then you have it physically delivered to your door using Uklon.
Wow. It's like a digital Swiss Army knife. If the cellular network is the handle of the knife, these apps are the essential tools keeping daily life functioning for citizens. You never have to actually leave the Kyivstar digital ecosystem. They also operate Kyivstar TV, which boasts 2.5 million active users and is heavily investing in original Ukrainian content. Plus, they currently have a pending $12 to $15 million acquisition of GigaCloud, which is a major national cloud provider.
The financial payoff for constructing this digital walled garden is crystal clear in the data, too.
Yeah, the ARPU numbers.
Right. A regular mobile-only user generates an average revenue per user, or ARPU, of about $3.80 a month. But a multiplay user, someone who uses the core phone network, plus these bundled apps like Helsi or Kyivstar TV, well, they generate $5.20.
That is a massive jump in revenue extracted from a single user.
It's huge. By locking users inside what they call a single customer journey, their customer acquisition costs absolutely plummet.
Right, because they don't have to spend millions on external marketing campaigns to find new users for Uklon or Helsi.
Exactly. They simply advertise those services directly via push notifications to their 23.3 million locked-in telecom subscribers. It essentially makes every new digital venture instantly profitable upon acquisition.
Okay, it's brilliant to lock users into a digital health app, but it completely ignores a massive physical vulnerability.
Yeah, the hardware.
Right. An app cannot write an e-prescription if the cell tower down the street is a smoldering crater, or if the data center has no power. We have to talk about the brutal physics of maintaining 16,500 cell sites in a literal war zone.
Yeah, the physical toll is staggering. In certain regions, depending on the intensity of the attacks, 40% to 60% of their physical infrastructure is regularly disconnected from the national power grid.
40 to 60%. And yet, according to the presentation deck, less than 10% of the network actually goes down at any given time.
It's unbelievable.
How is that physically possible when half the grid is dark?
Well, it comes down to a massive, rapid deployment of what Kyivstar calls a triple-layer security approach to energy.
Okay, what's layer one?
Layer 1 relies on batteries. They've rapidly installed 250,000 high-capacity batteries across their network sites to handle immediate short-term grid failures. Then Layer 2 involves heavy machinery. They have 3,700 diesel generators deployed across the country for when the blackout significantly outlasts the battery reserves.
I cannot even begin to fathom the sheer logistics of fueling and maintaining 3,700 generators in a conflict zone.
Right. It's a full-time military-level logistics operation.
But the third layer is what genuinely blew my mind. Solar power.
Yes.
They spent $115 million on energy resilience, which included outright buying an entire 13-megawatt solar power plant. And they aren't stopping there. They're currently eyeing a 104-megawatt Lviv cluster of solar parks.
It's massive scale.
So they are basically forced to become their own decentralized power company.
Yeah. The comparison to a biological organism is highly accurate here.
Oh, like adapting?
Exactly. When an organism's primary food source, in this case the national power grid, is severed, it must evolve to survive. Kyivstar essentially mutated so it could photosynthesize its own energy.
That's a crazy way to think about it, but it's so true.
But this evolutionary leap wasn't just about, altruistic survival.
Right. So what does this all mean for the bottom line?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this solar infrastructure is a highly calculated financial hedge. Energy prices in Ukraine have been spiking dramatically, surging around 18% a year.
Wow, 18%.
Yeah. And diesel for 3,700 generators is incredibly expensive and logistically fragile. By generating their own solar power at scale, they are hard capping their operational energy expenses.
That makes total sense.
This geopolitical crisis has accidentally forced Kyivstar into building one of the greenest, most decentralized, and self-sufficient telecom infrastructures on the planet.
And if the cell towers still manage to fail despite the batteries, the generators, and the solar plants, they look to space.
Starlink.
Exactly. Kyivstar partnered with SpaceX and Starlink. They're the first telecom operator in Europe to launch direct-to-cell, or DDC, service. They're utilizing 650 specialized Starlink satellites positioned in low Earth orbit so that any standard LTE smartphone can connect directly to space.
The technological mechanism behind DDC is a massive leap forward. You no longer need to buy a specialized satellite dish to connect to the network.
Right, no dish needed.
These specialized satellites essentially act as cell towers flying 500 kilometers above the Earth. It allows for basic emergency text messaging during total regional blackouts.
That is life-saving.
It is. But beyond the civilian safety aspect, it serves a critical economic function, too. It keeps the nation's payment infrastructure alive.
Oh, because point-of-sale systems require incredibly low bandwidth.
Exactly. Even if a city loses all municipal power and every local cell tower is destroyed, the MasterCard payment terminals can ping the satellite directly.
That's wild.
People can still buy food, medicine, and basic supplies. The local economy doesn't instantly collapse just because the power lines are cut.
It's incredible. But, you can't just wish these towers and networks into existence. Operating all this hardware requires navigating incredibly complex global supply chains. You can't just buy networking gear from anyone these days without massive geopolitical ramifications.
Oh, definitely not. Telecommunications infrastructure has become one of the most highly politicized industries globally.
For sure.
To secure their network and align with their Western allies, Kyivstar implemented a strict Europe-first strategy. They actively began ripping out all of their Chinese hardware, specifically equipment from Huawei and ZTE, which previously made up 70% of their entire network.
70% of the core network. That is like trying to change the operating system on millions of smartphones simultaneously without letting a single phone call drop.
It's insanely difficult.
They had to hot swap out the very brain of the network while the body was still actively sprinting.
It is an unprecedented logistical undertaking. They systematically replaced that Chinese hardware with gear from Nokia and Ericsson to fully align with European Union cybersecurity standards.
Wow.
And to further harden the network, they are also pooling their 8,000 radio towers in a joint venture with their primary rival, Vodafone Ukraine.
Which is wild, because normally Vodafone and Kyivstar run parallel, entirely competing hardware grids.
Right. But by pooling their towers, they effectively created a nationwide roaming network. If a Kyivstar antenna on a specific building goes dark, a user's phone will automatically jump to the Vodafone antenna on the next building over.
That's smart.
They combined their physical hardware grids to create massive redundancy for the entire population.
Now, navigating geopolitics also involves deeply complex corporate compliance. The sources we reviewed extensively outlined several corporate risk factors that institutional investors had to carefully evaluate.
Yes, the parent company.
Right. Kyivstar's parent company, VEON, has ties to an investment holding group called LetterOne. LetterOne was co-founded by Mikhail Fridman and Peter Avon. The financial filings note that both of those individuals were sanctioned by the EU following the outbreak of the conflict.
And from a pure compliance standpoint, that structure required intense scrutiny from Wall Street.
Obviously.
However, the filings strictly clarify that the corporate structure was heavily adjusted. Those individuals currently hold absolutely 0% voting rights, and the holding company itself is managed entirely by independent European and British entities.
Okay.
It is a strictly factual structural detail, but one that the compliance teams had to rigorously vet before allowing the NASDAQ Q listing to proceed.
Right. But beyond the corporate governance, the SPAC mergers, and the physical hardware, there is a deeply human element to this story that drives the entire machine. The CEO, Komarov, practices a leadership philosophy he calls strategic optimism.
Which is a vital concept when you examine the sheer psychological weight their workforce is enduring. This isn't abstract for them.
No, it's very real.
They have had 250 of their employees mobilized into the armed forces. Tragically, 20 of their employees have been killed during the conflict.
And yet, amidst that devastation, the executive team made conscious, incredibly expensive decisions that prioritized human beings over short-term quarterly profits.
Yeah, they really did.
At the very start of the war, they instituted a blanket policy where they simply did not disconnect any customers, regardless of whether those users had the money to pay their bills.
Wow.
And later, after that massive 36-hour cyber attack we mentioned, they gave every single user a free month of service to apologize. That single decision sacrificed 8% of their entire annual income.
But consider the return on that specific investment. They purchased unparalleled generational brand loyalty.
Oh, absolutely.
When a family is experiencing the absolute darkest moments of their lives, and your company provides the critical lifeline that allows them to text their loved ones to say, "I'm alive," they do not forget that.
Never.
That profound loyalty is the underlying engine that makes their digital super app strategy function so effectively. It drives their churn rate essentially to zero.
It's an unbelievable operational journey. I mean, we started with a finance executive placing a crazy email in a Mission Impossible folder, and we watched that evolve into a dominant digital ecosystem of public health applications and transit networks, all running on a physically hardened, decentralized network powered by massive solar installations and space satellites.
This raises an important question, actually, one explicitly brought up by Oksana Markarova, the Ukrainian ambassador to the United States.
Oh, what'd you say?
She introduced this concept of the war-resilient business. The reality is, we are entering a demonstrably more fragile era of global commerce. Supply chains are being actively weaponized around the world.
Right.
What Kyivstar has accomplished here isn't just an anomaly. It isn't merely an inspiring story of survival. It represents the new blueprint for corporate endurance everywhere.
It really forces you to examine your own daily life. I want you listening to this deep dive right now to reflect on your own workplace, your own business, or your own team.
Yeah, think about it.
If a telecommunications company can grow their revenue by 20%, launch entirely new digital verticals in healthcare and transit, and successfully list on the NASDAQ stock exchange, all while facing daily physical destruction and massive power grid collapses, well, what friction in your own daily workflow is actually just an excuse?
It drastically recalibrates what we consider to be a difficult quarter.
It really does.
And it leaves us with a final provocative thought to consider. For the last decade, corporate boards and institutional investors all over the world have been absolutely obsessed with the concept of ESG, environmental, social, and governance.
Right. Everyone talks about ESG.
ESG was treated as the ultimate definitive test of a company's readiness for the future. But based on the stark reality of Kyivstar's story, is that era fundamentally shifting? Will the new gold standard for global investors soon become WRB, the war-resilient business? In the very near future, will multinational companies be rated not just on their carbon footprint or their board diversity, but on their proven mechanical ability to survive the sudden collapse of the physical and digital society around them?
It really makes you wonder how fragile our normal systems actually are. Because if you're an investor and you're trying to figure out if a company's leadership team can survive a bad PR cycle or a supply chain delay, maybe you should instead be asking if they can survive having their power grid severed by 60% while simultaneously hot-swapping their entire infrastructure.
Exactly.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the impossible, and we'll see you next time.